And now for our last round of questions and reflections. Let us start with Counterpoint. In what world do Alberto and Sophie find themselves after escaping Albert Nagg's book? What seems to have happened exactly that landed them here? The reference we want to make here is going to be on page 487. We read towards the top of the page. Where are we? This is Oslo. Are you quite sure? Quite sure. One of these buildings is called Chateau Neuf, which means the new palace. People study music there. The other is the congregation faculty. It's a school of theology. Further up the hill, they study science, and up at the top, they study literature and philosophy. Are we out of Hilda's book and beyond the Major's control? Yes, both. He'll never find us here. It continues on a little bit with more description of exactly what happened. Alberto relates that there's a sort of embryo stage in which they entered into as they were going through the woods, importantly, outside of Albert Nagg's consciousness, right? Not outside of his awareness, outside. It is as if they crept underneath the unconscious during that period in which he was writing the final chapter of his book. They crept out and managed to go through the familiar imagery that they had experienced up to that point in the book, and then all of a sudden, bam, they're just there in front of this building, part of the university. So, and in Oslo, nonetheless. Oslo, if you weren't sure, by the way, is in Norway. So that's how I would have at least described it. As it was, he says on page 487, it went like a dream. Of course, there's always the chance that he was in on it himself. So whether Albert Nagg contributed in some indirect, unconscious, involuntary way or not, regardless, they managed to essentially escape his mind, is another way we can characterize that. What form do all fictional characters, as well as Alberto and Sophie now, exist in the world? And describe the nature of the parallel dimension they live in to ours. And we did a fair bit of this actually in the in-depth lecture in trying to spell out Gaarder's fictional realism. But let's go on and find some exact pages. There are a couple here. So on the very next page, 488, Sophie is trying to yell at the couple that is nearby them as they land in Oslo. And she goes back to Alberto saying, "They can't hear me," she said desperately. And just as she said it, she recalled her dream about Hilda and the gold crucifix. Remember, that's the same thing that happened there, and it's the same thing that happens again towards the end of the book. It's the price we have to pay. Although we have sneaked out of a book, we can't expect to have exactly the same status as its author. But we really are here. From now on, we will never be a day older than we were when we left the Philosophical Garden Party. It already gives a couple of hints of how this works. They won't be a day older. They will be for eternity existing. Now, again, in the in-depth lecture, I considered the hypothetical case of wiping out the human race and therefore all human minds. And then you have to wonder how fictional characters could exist in that realm. But what we can derive from this, what we can tell from this is that the world must be capable of substantiating them for eternity, regardless if there are human minds here to conceive of them or not. And note, it says, but we really are here. They are really there. They are real now. They're just real in a way that you and I can't perceive them. If they were right next to us, we'd have no idea. Next, check out the very next page on 489 at the very bottom. There's that little thing about the wind again that we brought up last time in the lecture. Tomorrow, they'll say a freak wind blew over the field. So they turn off of the drive to go through a wheat field. There is obviously some degree of causality between the two dimensions or layers of this world. Now, let's jump forward to page 493. The bottom there says something that, again, we spoke to in the lecture. They're driving top speed on the highway, and Sophie wonders, suppose we smash into another car? It makes no difference. It's just an ordinary car. But if it's one of our own, then what? then we'll have to be careful. Didn't you notice that we passed the Batmobile? I love that. Yeah, so obviously causality, again, is still a thing, and they can affect one another. But importantly, it's things within the same dimension that affect one another. If a brick wall came crashing down on them, no effect. But if a fictional brick wall came crashing down on them, then it would hurt them. And likewise, if they were to hit me in the head with a hammer, as Sophie attempts to do to Hilda, it appears that the most I am affected by it is something like a sting or something, which we didn't say much about in the lecture, but does kind of indicate what Gaarder suggests we can think of, these kind of strange things that happen in the world that we don't have an immediate explanation for, to be. This is actually coincidental enough. My wife last week was drawing the shades, and when she reached for the cord, she suddenly she drew back and said, "Oh my hand, oh, such pain." Didn't know what had happened for a while. We assumed, she said, it resembled a sting. It hurt so bad her hand started swelling, could find no evidence of anything. And so Gaarder would have an explanation for this. Maybe something in the fictional realm actually was responsible for that. Of course, in reality, what happened is, about 5 minutes later, I looked around the vents, and lo and behold, there was a lone paper wasp that was sitting on the floor and looking stunned itself, and took him outside. So it is a fun way to think about the things that have a causal nature in our world, but are inexplicable as possibly being causal from a different dimension or layer of the world. But again, we have to always check that against maybe what we really want to think of explain it. I'm not saying there aren't inexplicable things. I just think we have to be careful about the way that we decide whether or not the inexplicableness is something that we can derive from some fictional layer. This is an interesting philosophy again, but it's a wonder that we would go this direction in the modern age. That said, part of what's quaint and wonderful about Gaarder is he wants to continue to imbibe fantasy and fiction with some form of existence, and this I have to agree with. These things can exist, but they can only exist for us. And perhaps, again, maybe if I were the one whose hand stung and I couldn't find the paper wasp, perhaps I would explain it by some sort of fantastic, the window bit me, or something to that extent. I could come up with a fantastical explanation, and at least for me, that would appear to be a doable explanation, or an explanation that at least works for me personally, even if it doesn't jive with the rest of the world very well. Now go go down page 494, and we can see also that Sophie says that means we're spirits of the air compared to our surroundings. No, now you're putting the cart before the horse, says Alberto. It is the reality around us that's an airy adventure to us. I don't get it. Listen carefully then. It is a widespread misunderstanding that spirit is the thing that is more airy than vapor. On the contrary, spirit is more solid than ice. What does this mean? Is he talking about actual physical instantiations of matter? Well, probably not, because I think we would agree this is pretty solid stuff. My body, this desk, whatever. And the idea that they could walk through it then means what? It means that he's wanting to perhaps take that as an analogy for what's going on here. In a way, this fictional layer is more real. The creation, in some sense, that we were talking about in the lecture, is more real than the creator in some sense. If not more real per se, then perhaps at least more something, more solid, is how he's going with it for now, perhaps for lack of a better word or a concept that's going to fit this very well. But it does not, he's trying to indicate that it does not make it airy-fairy, it doesn't make it something more transient or ephemeral, which are the sort of things that we conceive ghosts and spirits to be, rather something even more substantially present in the world, perhaps, than even we are. Jump to the next page, 495, and they're trying to get drinks at the cafe, and Alberto gets angry, but then he starts laughing. They were about to turn around and leave when an old woman got up from her chair and came toward them. She was wearing a garish red skirt and an ice blue cardigan and a white kerchief around her head. She seemed more sharply defined than anything else in the little cafeteria. That more sharply defined thing again. Clear and distinct idea comes back to mind from Descartes. Is there something about the ideas in their, not in their first conception, but reflected on time and time again? Ideas that become clearer and more defined, such that when they become real, at least for Gaarder, when the fictional element or character becomes part of the world, it's even clearer and more defined than the other things that we've barely reflected on around them. Now we're going to jump a bit farther forward to 499, about midway down. My dear Sophie, after a whole course in philosophy, I'm very disappointed to find you still jumping to conclusions. She's assuming that they're alone in the woods. Yes, but surely you don't believe this place is entirely devoid of trolls, pixie, wood nymphs, and good fairies. Oh, excuse me. This is just fun because it's interesting to imagine that the entirety of the world, or at least all the places where we would think there's nothing fictional to speak of, that is, things within human culture, being in the city, we can entertain a lot of these ideas, perhaps, that there are fictional imaginary characters walking around in the city. But what about nature, what you and I call nature, the depth of the woods, maybe even the inside of a volcano? Can you imagine maybe all these places that don't even have a lot of direct relation to human civilization and culture, at least directly again, are somehow also the dwelling places of these fictional creatures, fictional elements. It's as if things that are human, that is conceived of by human minds, nonetheless somehow inhabit every facet of this world and reality. And then on page 500, Sophie has tried to get Hilda's attention. She sat right next to her, yelled at her, shouted at her. Hilda is waiting, of course, for her father. And then she thinks, what was that? She thought she heard a faint breath of something, exactly as in her dream about Sophie. She turned around quickly. There was something. She was sure of it, but what? Maybe it was only the summer night. For a few seconds, she was afraid she was hearing things. We hear things, don't we? We hear things a lot. I hear things. I'm often talking to myself, even in my head, when I'm not voicing it out loud. I don't know about you. And there are times when I think that I've heard something and I'm not sure what it was. If you haven't experienced that before, I'd be surprised. So here's again a possible explanation. The spirits are whispering to us, not in some just like ghost story sort of way, but in a way that for Gaarder is a dimension that has this greater solidity, greater something in it that is constantly trying to perhaps, or at least if these entities are anything like Sophie in any regard, constantly perhaps trying to get our attention, or at least occasionally doing so. And we perceive it as a hearing of things, or a presence. You feel that something is present nearby. An old friend of mine would continue to remind me for years that she was absolutely convinced that Jesus Christ visited her at this one point and that she could feel his presence. Regardless of my own takings of that, Gaarder would have an explanation for that. The quasi-fictionality, and I don't think he would talk about Jesus this way perhaps, but Jesus of the cross would be, in a sense, perhaps a fictional creature of sorts and would exist in the world for this young lady that I knew at the time, my colleague, who then was indeed in her presence perhaps, and she knew it, she felt it. It gives a lot of credit to the intuition, which I actually am very approving of. Intuition is a very powerful faculty of ours. That said, I don't know if we can give credit to our explanations that intuition develops for us without further reflection and investigation. And so that's the world that Gaarder has shown us, composed of both the things that you and I are and many of these fictional elements that have been created over time and history and will live forever beyond us from this point forward. I believe it was Shakespeare who said, the written word, when written well, is going to persevere long after the life of the writer. And perhaps that sense of eternity of not just written words, but of the actual elements of which are written, do, at least for Gaarder, of course, persevere in that sense. What does Hilda do to her father in order to teach him a lesson? Is she successful, do you think, in doing that? So this takes place in that chapter on pages 490 to 493, and you can go back and reference those. The gist, though, is pretty clear. She leaves envelopes for him around the airport. He reads them. He feels as though he's being, in a sense, controlled. I think he has a pretty short temper, actually, and then it gets even weirder over time. I mean, he's of course called on the intercom. All these things are conceivable. It starts to get really interesting, though, as they move along, because then there are banners over bridges and stuff like that. That shows up on page 498. So towards the bottom of that page, they drove out onto E18. Every bridge and tunnel they passed was draped with banners saying, "Welcome home, the turkey is ready, I can see you, Dad." When we were reading Sophie and Alberto's story, it seemed rather fantastical that airplanes would have "Happy Birthday Hilda" on it. That you'd open a banana, "Happy Birthday Hilda." The dog says "Happy Birthday Hilda." Now those got really out of sorts. But this is getting kind of borderline there. This is getting borderline. How on earth is this girl, even with the help of a number of people, managed to do so much in so little time? To get the envelopes up, to get the intercom system to work. The fact that she even got the cooperation by the airport today, I don't think that would be possible. Certainly not in today's airports. But assuming she somehow managed to pull that off, she still has banners over every bridge on highways and stuff. Does this not seem a little over the top to you? Does it not seem a little like Gaarder is playing his hand here too and saying, yep, I'm doing the same thing that Albert Nag was doing in Alberto and Sophie's story? Anyway, just a thought. At the top of that same page, he had been given a taste of his own medicine, but with a significant difference surely. His medicine had first and foremost affected Sophie and Alberto, and they were only imaginary. But then, so is he. As far as whether or not it's successful, that's a subjective question. I'll let you answer that. And now we arrive at the last chapter. In what ways does Sophie attempt to get Hilda's attention, or at least influence her in some way? What does it reveal about the nature of this world? We've talked about this a lot already so far, but if we look on page 510, we want to take a look at this specific description here. Finally, she, Sophie, raised the wrench above her head and crashed it down on Hilda's forehead. "Ouch!" said Hilda. Then Sophie hit the Major on his forehead, but he didn't react at all. "What was that?" he asked. "I think I've just been stung by a gadfly." It was probably Socrates trying to sting you into life. Sophie lay down on the grass and tried to push the glider, but it remained motionless. Or did she manage to get it to move a millimeter? We talked a lot about causality in the in-depth lecture too. But there's something specifically interesting about this part of the passage, because Sophie hit both of them on the head. And yet Hilda was the only one who felt it. What's that about? That example I gave earlier about if I had grabbed, instead of my wife in the lecture, if I had grabbed the drawstrings to the shades of my window and it felt a sting, maybe I could have had my own fictitious explanation for it. But it would seem, according to Gaarder, I would first have to believe in the possibility of a fictitious or a fantastical entity, a ghost or the window itself biting me. I'd have to believe in that first for that to even be true, for that apparently to be experienced. That seems to be something we can derive from this. Sophie clearly has some form of causality on things. Again, this is very mind-centric. This is very human mind-centric. So she can move and cause things that don't necessarily need to believe in her. But for some person or another mind to believe in, to experience her causal effects, they have to believe in her. So, and we know Albert Nag is convinced that Sophie and Albert, the characters he created, fictitious, imaginary. He will not experience them. So what does this say? Does this say that we can only, maybe the person who believes in ghosts is the only kind of person who can experience ghosts? That would seem to be the sort of conclusion Gaarder would have us draw. One other quick reference on that. I recommend reading through 512 again, but specifically let's look at 5 5:13, this whole scene with the rowboat. On 5:13, it's as good as nailed down, said Alberto. We've got plenty of time. A true philosopher must never give up. If we could just get it loose. Our creations, according to Gaarder, are going to outlast us. They have eternity to work on the problems that we can't solve due to our finitude of life. Our lifespans will not accommodate the bigger unsolved problems, perhaps. But maybe our creations, the fictitious characters that come into this world that are real for Gaarder, maybe they will. Maybe they will solve these problems. Maybe they'll get the ropes loose. A little farther down, Abernag wonders if there's anyone out there in the night of the light years. And then what happens? Hilda notices that the rowboat has worked itself loose. He makes fun of her a little bit. Again, he doesn't believe what's going on. He doesn't believe Sophie and Alberto and so forth. What is this scene that's being characterized here? She says, go ahead and make fun of me. All evening I've been able to feel someone out here. She's the one who can experience the ghosts, the spirits, as it were, because she believes in them. He's looking up to the stars, and rightly so. It's fascinating, beautiful. But he's wondering, who's out there? He's missing what's happening in this world right here. Completely missing it. Doesn't believe. His mind... Remember, this was a very important message of this book as well, that Alberto relates to us. The younger generations are typically having to, as he says in the garden party, are going to have to rethink the way reality works and therefore overcome the stagnated thought or stagnated ideas and concepts of the prior generation. And this is going to happen all the time. Hilda believes that there could be Sophie and Alberto literally in this world with her. No exact reason why, but she believes. She's exhibiting a sort of faith. Not the faith as in Kierkegaard, in this sort of God and religious stage sort of thing, but more like perhaps in a way like that, only in the sense that then she's capable of experiencing what others cannot. But she's also then exhibiting a faith that Kant is talking about. This kind of faith is the faith that our intuition provides us with, a faith that there are things in themselves out there. And even if they're a different sense to Gaarder than they would be for you or definitely for me, nonetheless, the things in themselves are out there, and we can take faith in that. She does, and therefore it has changed her world and her experience, and maybe she will be capable of perceiving and understanding things others will not. I believe that faith in real things also makes a difference in your reality. And for the final question, in philosophical terms, what is the impenetrable question that Abernag leaves Hilda and us with near the tail end of the book? And you will have to read more deeply than what is on the page here. On 5:12, just going back a smidge, he's talking again about this one single substance that we're all comprised of, fictitious or not, in my view. We are a spark from the great fire that was ignited many billions of years ago. That's a beautiful thought too, says Hilda. However, we must not exaggerate the importance of these figures. It is enough just to hold a stone in your hand. The universe would have been equally incomprehensible if it had only consisted of that one stone the size of an orange. The question would be just as impenetrable. Where did this stone come from? We started with 2 questions of Sophie's at the very beginning of this all. We came up with a million others over the time that we've spent together, but the 2 most important questions in regard to the book that Gaarder wrote were, who are you and where does the world come from? We got the sense of who they are, and we discovered that who they are or what they are didn't matter as much as that they are, to paraphrase Alberto. Through Gaarder's existentialism, that is the stance to take here in regards to this book. It doesn't matter who or what we are per se, so much as that we are. We will never maybe understand the substance that we are, understand what bottom line fundamental substance that he believes us to all be consisting in. We will never understand what that is, perhaps. Maybe that's the question to continue to peruse. But if not, but this other impenetrable question is relating to that second one. Where does the will come from? How could it be here? In fact, that question almost wraps up both of them at once, because being here and, where does it come from? And then the fact that it's here at all is the question. It's the fundamental drive for the entirety of this book, for Gaarder's philosophy. And in a way, it's speaking to something that we really are not going to be able to answer. It's speaking to a truly philosophical question. Not all questions that remain unanswerable are necessarily philosophical, and not necessarily every philosophical question doesn't end up having an answer somewhere along the way. But we have good reason to think that we will never be able to answer some of these questions of philosophical nature. If the cosmic event horizon exists, is a real thing, and it would appear to be, and the Big Bang is a real starting point in the time of the universe, how could we possibly fathom being able to understand the nature of what lies beyond either of those things? Impenetrable, impossible to penetrate, impossible to get beyond. And this is where Gaarder leaves us, for the most part, with these really big questions that we should nonetheless try to comprehend and reflect on and answer. That may be for you through science, that may be through mathematics, it might be through literature, or it might be through philosophy. Maybe all of the above if you choose philosophy. Regardless of what you move on to do from here, I hope that you will hold philosophy close to your heart and continue to investigate for the rest of your lives. Thank you, and take care.